The storm that canceled my business trip to Portland should have been my first warning that Thursday wasn't going to end well. I'd been driving logistics routes for Northeastern Supply for 8 years, and weather delays were just part of the job. What I didn't expect was to walk into my own kitchen at 6:30 in the evening and find my wife Zoya standing there in nothing but a silk robe, while my boss, Pierce Lawton, buttoned his shirt with the casual confidence of a man who owned the place. "Kellen," Pierce said, not even bothering to look surprised. His voice carried that same corporate smoothness he used in board meetings. "Thought you were in Portland until tomorrow." Zoya stood frozen behind the kitchen island, her dark hair still messed up, lips pressed into a thin line. She wouldn't meet my eyes. The coffee maker was still warm, 2 cups sitting on the counter. My coffee maker, my kitchen, my wife. "Storm grounded the flights," I said, setting my travel bag down slowly. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "Looks like I missed the party." Pierce straightened his tie and smiled. Not a guilty smile or an apologetic one, a predator's smile. "Here's the thing, Brooks. You seem like a smart guy, smart enough to know when to keep your mouth shut if you want to keep drawing a paycheck." I felt something cold settle in my chest, but it wasn't fear. It was clarity. Pure, crystalline clarity about exactly who I was dealing with and what kind of situation I'd walked into. "Is that right?" I asked. "That's right." Pierce picked up his jacket from the back of my kitchen chair. "Zoya and I have been discussing some changes around the office. Budget cuts, you know. Seems like your position might be redundant." Zoya finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Kellen, we should talk about this later." "Should we?" I looked at her directly for the first time since walking in. She was beautiful, even now. Even like this. That's what had drawn me to her 7 years ago at that company mixer. Beautiful, ambitious, sharp as a razor. I'd thought those were good things. "What exactly should we talk about, Zoya?" Pierce stepped closer, and I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something else. Something that belonged to my wife. "We should talk about how you're going to pretend this conversation never happened. How you're going to go upstairs, unpack your bag, and forget you came home early tonight." The refrigerator hummed in the silence. Outside, the storm that had grounded my flight continued to pound against the windows. I could hear Mrs. Pritchard's dog barking next door, probably spooked by the thunder. "Or what?" I asked. Pierce's smile widened. "Or you'll find out how quickly a man can go from middle management to unemployment in this economy. Your choice, Brooks." I picked up my keys from the counter where I'd just set them down. The metal felt cold against my palm. "You know what, Pierce? I think I'll take a drive. Clear my head. Think about what you said." "Smart man," Pierce said. I walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "Oh, and Pierce, next time you want to threaten someone in their own house, you might want to make sure their security camera isn't recording." It was a bluff. We didn't have security cameras. But the way Pierce's face went pale for just a split second told me everything I needed to know about how guilty he felt and how much he had to lose. I left them standing there in my kitchen and walked out into the storm. Mrs. Pritchard was on her covered porch, probably drawn outside by the sound of voices carrying through the thin summer air. She was 73 years old and had lived next door since before Zoya and I bought the house. She saw everything that happened on Maple Street, and she remembered all of it. "Rough evening, Kellen?" she called out as I got to my car. "Getting rougher by the minute, Mrs. Pritchard." "That fancy car in your driveway belongs to your boss, doesn't it? The one with the personalized plates?" I looked back at Pierce's black BMW sitting in my driveway like it belonged there. The license plate read, Pierce 1, subtle as a brick through a window. "Yeah, that's his. Funny time for a business meeting," she said, then went back inside. I sat in my car for a few minutes, letting the rain hammer against the windshield while I thought about what I'd just witnessed. 7 years of marriage, 8 years of working for Pierce Lawton, climbing my way up from warehouse supervisor to logistics manager, all of it crashing down in the space of 5 minutes in my own kitchen. But here's the thing about working in logistics for 8 years. You learn to think systematically. You learn to track things. You learn that every shipment has a paper trail, every transaction has a record, and every lie eventually gets exposed if you know where to look. I started the engine and drove toward downtown, toward Jody's Tavern on Commercial Street. If I was going to plan what came next, I needed a drink and a clear head, and Jody Martinez had been my friend since high school. She'd know what to do. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the streets into rivers. Perfect weather for the end of the world as I knew it. Jody's Tavern occupied the ground floor of a converted textile mill building that had been there since the 1890s. The bar itself was dark wood and brass fixtures, with the kind of atmosphere that made you want to tell the truth, even when it hurt. Jody had bought the place 5 years ago after her divorce, and she'd turned it into the kind of establishment where working people could drink in peace without pretending to be something they weren't. I found her behind the bar, polishing glasses and watching the local news on the mounted television. The place was mostly empty, except for a couple of regulars nursing beers at the far end. Well, Jody said when she saw me. Look what the storm dragged in. Thought you were supposed to be in Portland until tomorrow. Change of plans? I took a stool at the bar. Whiskey. Make it a double. Jody poured the drink and set it in front of me. She was 41, 3 years older than me, with graying brown hair and the kind of direct gaze that cut through nonsense. You look like someone just told you Christmas was canceled. What happened? I took a sip of the whiskey and felt it burn all the way down. Found my wife in bed with my boss. Well, not exactly in bed. Kitchen counter seemed to be working fine for them. Pierce Lawton? The very same. Jody let out a low whistle. That explains why Zoya's been coming in here every Thursday night for the past 2 months, meeting with some guy in expensive suits. I figured it was business. Thursday nights? I thought about that. I worked late most Thursdays, handling the weekly inventory reports. How expensive are we talking? Custom tailored, gold watch, the kind of guy who orders top-shelf everything and tips exactly 15%. Jody refilled my glass without being asked. They always sat in the back booth, heads together like they were planning something important. Planning something. I repeated the words, tasting them. Jody, can I ask you something? In your expert opinion as a bartender and observer of human nature, when 2 people meet secretly every week for 2 months, are they just having an affair, or is there usually more to it? Depends on the people. But in my experience, when one of them works in finance and the other one runs a company, they're usually talking about more than just their feelings. Zoya worked in finance. She was an accounts manager for Meridian Financial, the parent company that had acquired Northeastern Supply 3 years ago. She handled vendor relationships and expense approvals. She had access to payment systems and budget reports that most people in the company never saw. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my email until I found what I was looking for. Jody, take a look at this. She leaned over the bar to read the screen. It was an email chain from 2 weeks ago between Pierce and the Meridian corporate office discussing budget overruns in the logistics department, my department. See this line here? I pointed to a specific entry. Emergency transport costs, $15,000, but I never authorized any emergency transports that week. I would have remembered. Could be a mistake? Could be. Or it could be that someone's been creating fake expenses and pocketing the money. I scrolled to another email. Look at this one. Vendor payment to ZH Consulting Services for supply chain analysis. $22,000. Jody's eyes widened. ZH Zoya Haldenor. Zoya Haldenor, I confirmed. My wife has been billing my company for consulting services she never provided, and my boss has been approving the payments. That's fraud. That's exactly what it is. I finished my whiskey and felt the pieces clicking into place. And I've been signing off on the logistics reports that make it all look legitimate. My phone buzzed with a text message from Zoya. Where did you go? We need to talk. I showed the message to Jody. What do you think I should say? I think you should say nothing. At least not until you figure out how deep this goes. She paused, considering. Kellen, if they've been stealing money through your department and if this comes out, who do you think they're going to blame? The answer was obvious. They'd blame me, the logistics manager who signed the reports, the husband who had access to his wife's computer and banking information, the guy who would have both motive and opportunity to embezzle funds and then point fingers when he got caught. They're setting me up, I said. Looks that way. Question is, what are you going to do about it? I thought about Pierce standing in my kitchen, threatening my job with that smug smile. I thought about Zoya refusing to meet my eyes. I thought about Thursday nights and secret meetings and fake consulting fees. I'm going to beat them at their own game, I said. But first, I need to get some evidence. Jody reached under the bar and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind reporters use for interviews. My ex-husband was a cheating piece of work, too. Sometimes you need proof. Thanks. I pocketed the recorder. One more favor? Name it. If anyone asks, I was here all evening, drinking alone and feeling sorry for myself. Weren't you? Yeah. But tomorrow I'm going to start feeling sorry for them instead. I left Jody's around 9:30 and drove home through streets still slick with rain. Pierce's BMW was gone from my driveway, but the lights were on in the kitchen. Zoya was waiting for me. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, still wearing the silk robe, but with jeans underneath now. Her makeup was perfect again, every hair in place. She looked like she was posing for a magazine photo about successful women having quiet moments at home. We need to talk, she said when I walked in. Do we? I hung my keys on the hook by the door and noticed that the coffee cups were gone from the counter. The kitchen looked normal again, like nothing had happened. About what? About what you think you saw tonight? What I think I saw. I sat down across from her at the table where we'd eaten breakfast together that morning, where we'd planned our weekend, where we'd talked about maybe starting a family someday. Enlighten me, Zoya. What did I think I saw? Pierce came by to discuss some changes at work. Budget cuts. Your department might be affected. Her voice was steady, controlled. She'd had 2 hours to practice this conversation. Things got a little heated. We were both frustrated about the situation. Heated enough for you to take your clothes off? I spilled coffee on my shirt. Pierce was helping me clean it up when you walked in. She met my eyes directly, and I had to admire the performance. If I hadn't seen what I'd seen, I might have believed her. I know how it looked, but nothing happened. Nothing happened, I repeated. Nothing happened, she confirmed. But Pierce is concerned about your reaction, about what you might say to people at work. What might I say? You might spread rumors, make accusations, create a hostile work environment. She leaned forward slightly. Kellen, you know how these things work. Even false allegations can ruin careers. Pierce has worked hard to build his reputation. I nodded slowly, like I was considering her words. And what about my reputation? What about my career? That's why we need to handle this carefully. Pierce is willing to overlook tonight, if you're willing to be discreet. Professional. Discreet, I said. Professional. Exactly. I stood up from the table. I'm tired, Zoya. It's been a long day. I think I'll go to bed. Relief flickered across her face. That's probably best. We can talk more tomorrow if you want. Sure, I said. Tomorrow. But I wasn't planning to sleep. I was planning to spend the night going through every email, every expense report, and every financial document I could access. Because if Zoya and Pierce thought they could threaten me into silence, they were about to learn that they'd picked the wrong logistics manager to mess with. Some people collect stamps. Some people collect coins. For the past 8 years, I'd been collecting evidence without even knowing it. I waited until I heard Zoya's breathing settle into the rhythm of sleep then slipped out of bed and went downstairs to my home office. The room was small, cramped with filing cabinets and boxes of old work documents that I'd probably never need again. But logistics managers are natural pack rats. We keep everything, because you never know when you might need to trace a shipment or verify a delivery or prove that you did your job correctly. Tonight, that habit was going to pay off. I started with the most recent expense reports, working backward through the past 6 months. It didn't take long to find the pattern. Payments to ZH Consulting Services appeared regularly, usually for amounts between $15,000 and $25,000. Always approved by Pierce, always for vague services like supply chain optimization or vendor relationship analysis. But here's what Pierce didn't know. I kept copies of everything. Every email, every approval form, every piece of documentation that crossed my desk. It was a habit I'd developed after a previous boss had tried to blame me for a missing shipment that turned out to be his mistake. I pulled out my laptop and started cross-referencing the ZH consulting payments with actual work performed. The pattern was clear. Every payment to Zoya's fake consulting company corresponded with a period when I was out of the office on business trips or handling off-site logistics problems. They'd been using my absence to process fraudulent payments, then covering their tracks by burying the expenses in legitimate departmental budgets. Clever, but not clever enough. My phone buzzed with a text message. I expected it to be from Zoya, but the number was Pierce's. Need to talk. Important. Meet me at the office tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. before anyone else arrives. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Sure thing, boss." But I wasn't planning to go to that meeting empty-handed. I spent the next 3 hours documenting everything. I scanned expense reports, copied email chains, and compiled a timeline that showed exactly when each fraudulent payment had been processed. By 4 in the morning, I had a folder thick enough to choke a horse, and every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Pierce and Zoya had been stealing from Northeastern Supply for at least 6 months, possibly longer. They'd used my department as a cover and my authorization codes to make it look legitimate. And when they got caught, they were planning to pin the blame on me. The beauty of it was almost admirable. The logistics manager with access to vendor payments and a wife who worked in finance. Who would believe that I wasn't involved? But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed I was stupid. I printed 3 copies of everything, put one set in a safety deposit box at my bank, mailed another set to myself at a post office box I'd rented years ago for personal business, and kept the third set in my office safe. Then I drove to work to meet Pierce, with Jody's digital recorder in my shirt pocket and a plan that would have made Machiavelli proud. Northeastern Supply occupied a converted warehouse complex on the industrial side of town. The main office building was a 2-story brick structure that had been updated sometime in the 1980s and hadn't been touched since. Pierce's corner office was on the 2nd floor, with windows overlooking the loading docks where trucks came and went all day. I found him there at 7 sharp, sitting behind his mahogany desk with a cup of coffee and a stack of papers. He was wearing another expensive suit, this one charcoal gray with a red tie. The uniform of a man who wanted everyone to know he was important. "Brooks," he said when I knocked on his door frame. "Come in. Close the door." I closed the door and took a seat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. The recorder in my pocket was already running. "We have a problem," Pierce said without preamble. "Do we?" "Last night was unfortunate. I think we can both agree on that." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "But what's done is done. The question now is how we move forward." "I'm listening." "Zoya explained the situation to you. The budget cuts, the department restructuring. These are difficult decisions, but they're necessary for the company's financial health." I nodded. "Times are tough." "Exactly. And in times like these, we need team players. People who understand that sometimes personal feelings have to take a back seat to business realities." "Makes sense." Pierce smiled, probably thinking this was going better than he'd expected. I'm glad you see it that way, because I'm prepared to offer you something that might make this transition easier. What kind of something? A promotion. Senior logistics coordinator for the Eastern region. It would mean more travel but also a significant salary increase. 40% plus expenses. 40%. That was a substantial raise, the kind that could change someone's life. It was also the kind of offer that would look suspicious if it came right after I'd caught him with my wife. That's generous, I said. I believe in rewarding loyalty, Pierce replied, and I believe you're the kind of man who understands the value of discretion. Discretion. Professional discretion. Personal discretion. The kind of mature approach that separates successful people from those who let their emotions cloud their judgment. I pretended to consider this. And if I'm not interested in the promotion? Pierce's smile faded slightly. Then I'm afraid we'd have to consider other options. The budget cuts I mentioned are real, Brooks. Your current position may not survive the next quarterly review. I see. I hope you do. Because I'd hate to see a good employee make a bad decision based on a misunderstanding. There it was. The threat, delivered with corporate politeness but crystal clear in its meaning. Take the promotion and keep quiet, or lose your job and watch your reputation get destroyed. Can I think about it? I asked. Of course, but I'll need an answer by the end of the week. Fair enough. I stood up to leave, then paused at the door. Pierce, can I ask you something? Sure. How long have you and Zoya been planning this? His face went carefully blank. Planning what? The promotion, the budget cuts, all of it. I smiled. Just curious about the timeline. We've been discussing departmental changes for several weeks, he said slowly. Several weeks. Right around the time you started meeting at Jody's Tavern. Now his face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do. Thursday nights, back booth, expensive whiskey. Jody remembers everything, Pierce. It's part of her charm. Pierce stood up behind his desk. Brooks, I think you're misunderstanding. I don't think I am. But like you said, I've got until the end of the week to decide. I opened the door. I'll be in touch. I left him standing there and walked back to my office, where I immediately sent an encrypted email to my personal account with the audio file from our conversation. Then I called in sick for the rest of the day and drove home to start phase 2 of my plan. Zoya was gone when I got there, probably at work, probably calling Pierce to find out how our meeting had gone. But Mrs. Pritchard was in her garden, watering her roses and keeping an eye on the neighborhood like always. Morning, Kellen, she called out. You're home early. Felt a little under the weather, I said. Mrs. Pritchard, can I ask you a favor? Of course, dear. If anyone comes by asking questions about last night, about who was here or when they left, would you mind keeping track of what they want to know? Her eyes sharpened with interest. What kind of questions? The kind that people ask when they're trying to cover up something they shouldn't have been doing. Mrs. Pritchard smiled. I do love a good mystery. Don't worry, Kellen. I'll keep my eyes open. Thanks. I appreciate it. I went inside and started making phone calls. First to my lawyer, then to my accountant, then to a private investigator that Jody had recommended. By noon, I had appointments set up for the rest of the week and a strategy that would expose Pierce and Zoya's fraud while protecting myself from their attempts to frame me. The best part was that they'd never see it coming. They thought they were dealing with a heartbroken husband who could be bought off or intimidated into silence. They were about to learn that they'd underestimated the wrong guy. By Wednesday morning, I had everything in place. The private investigator, a sharp woman named Carmen Walsh, had confirmed what I already suspected about the ZH consulting payments. She'd also uncovered something I hadn't expected. Pierce had been skimming money from other departments too, using a network of fake vendors and inflated contracts that went back almost 2 years. Your wife wasn't the architect, Carmen told me during our meeting at a diner across town. She was just the latest recruit. Pierce has been running this scam since shortly after the Meridian acquisition. He's stolen close to $500,000. How many people are involved? At least 3 that I can confirm. Your wife, a guy in HR named Mark Stevens, and someone in accounts payable who's been processing the fake invoices. Carmen slid a folder across the table. The good news is that you're not on any of the paperwork, except as an unwitting accomplice. The bad news is that if this comes out wrong, you'll still look guilty by association. What do you recommend? Get ahead of it. Report the fraud yourself with evidence before they have a chance to frame you. Corporate compliance will investigate, and if your documentation is solid, you'll be protected as a whistleblower. That afternoon, I called Meridian Financial's corporate compliance hotline and filed a formal complaint. I provided them with copies of all the fraudulent expense reports, the fake consulting payments, and the email chains that showed Pierce's involvement. I also mentioned that I had audio recordings of Pierce threatening my job if I reported what I'd discovered. The compliance officer, a woman named Janet Morrison, told me they'd launch an immediate investigation and that I'd be protected under the company's whistleblower policy. She also advised me to continue working normally until the investigation was complete. Don't let anyone know you filed this complaint, she warned. If the allegations are true, the subjects might try to destroy evidence or retaliate against you. Understood, I said. But I wasn't planning to keep quiet much longer. Thursday evening, I drove to Jody's Tavern and waited. If the pattern held, Zoya and Pierce would show up for their weekly meeting around 8 o'clock. I wanted to see how they acted now that the pressure was building. They arrived right on schedule, Pierce in his usual expensive suit, and Zoya wearing a black dress that probably cost more than most people's rent. They took their usual table in the back, ordered their usual drinks, and started talking in the urgent, hushed tones of people who knew they were in trouble. I sat at the bar with my back to them, nursing a beer and listening to Jody provide commentary. They look nervous, she murmured as she wiped down glasses. Your wife keeps checking her phone, and Pierce looks like he's ready to jump out of his skin. Good, I said. You know what you're doing? I know exactly what I'm doing. Around 9:30, Pierce got up to use the bathroom. I waited until he was out of sight, then walked over to Zoya's table. Mind if I join you? I asked, sliding into Pierce's chair before she could answer. Zoya's face went white. Kellen, what are you doing here? Having a drink, same as you. I smiled. Although I have to say, this is an interesting place for a finance meeting. Very atmospheric. This isn't... Relax, Zoya. I know exactly what this is. I leaned forward. The question is, what are you planning to do about it? I don't know what you mean. Sure you do. You and Pierce have been stealing money from Northeastern Supply. You've been using my department to cover your tracks. And now that I've caught you, you're trying to figure out how to pin the blame on me. Zoya glanced toward the bathroom, probably hoping Pierce would come back and handle this conversation. You're being paranoid. Am I? Because I've got copies of every fake invoice, every fraudulent expense report, and every payment to your consulting company. I've also got audio recordings of Pierce threatening my job if I don't keep quiet. Her composure cracked slightly. You're recording conversations? I'm documenting everything. It's what logistics managers do. I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen. See this? It's the corporate compliance hotline. One phone call, and this whole thing becomes a federal investigation. Kellen, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. You and Pierce thought you could steal money, threaten me into silence, and then frame me if things went bad. But you made one mistake. What mistake? You assumed I was stupid. Pierce returned from the bathroom and stopped short when he saw me sitting at his table. His face cycled through several expressions before settling on forced calm. Brooks, he said, this is unexpected. Is it? I thought we should all sit down and discuss our mutual problem. Pierce remained standing. What problem is that? The problem where you've been embezzling money from your own company and trying to frame me for it. I gestured to the empty chair. Sit down, Pierce. We have a lot to talk about. He sat, but his posture was tense, ready to run or fight. I think you're confused about something. I don't think I am, but let me clarify the situation for both of you. I pulled out the digital recorder and set it on the table. This conversation is being recorded. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Zoya started to stand up. I'm leaving. No, you're not. My voice was quiet but firm. Because if you leave now, I make that phone call to corporate compliance. And then you'll be explaining this to federal investigators instead of to me. She sat back down. Here's what's going to happen, I continued. Tomorrow morning, you're both going to confess to your supervisors. You're going to provide full documentation of the fraud, return all the money you've stolen, and resign from your positions. Pierce laughed, but it sounded forced. Or what? Or I turn over everything I have to the authorities, and you both go to prison for embezzlement and conspiracy to commit fraud. I picked up the recorder. Your choice. You can't prove anything, Zoya said, but her voice was shaking. I can prove everything. Bank records, email chains, audio recordings, witness statements. I've got enough evidence to bury both of you. Pierce leaned forward. Brooks, let's be reasonable here. We can work something out. We already worked something out. You steal, you confess, you resign. Simple. And if we don't? I smiled. Then you find out how much federal prosecutors enjoy cases with this much documentation. I stood up from the table. You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Choose wisely. I left them sitting there and walked back to the bar, where Jody was grinning like she'd just watched the best show of her life. That was beautiful, she said. It's not over yet, I replied. But it's about to be. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that made everything look washed out and tired. I got to the office early, around 6:30, and sat in my car watching the building. I wanted to see who showed up first and how they looked when they did. Pierce's BMW pulled into the parking lot at 7:15. He sat behind the wheel for several minutes, probably making phone calls or trying to work up the courage to face what was coming. When he finally got out of the car, he looked like a man walking to his own execution. Zoya arrived 20 minutes later, driving her silver Lexus with the careful precision of someone who couldn't afford to make any mistakes. She parked 3 spaces away from Pierce's car and sat there for almost 10 minutes before going inside. I gave them another half hour to stew, then walked into the building like it was any other Friday morning. The first sign that something had changed was the way people looked at me. Conversations stopped when I walked by. Eyes followed me down the hallway. The receptionist, Nancy, gave me a sympathetic smile that suggested she knew something I was supposed to know. I found out what that something was when I got to my office and saw 2 men in dark suits waiting by my desk. Kellen Brooks? The taller one asked. That's me. Detective Ray Avery, State Police Financial Crimes Unit. This is Detective Collins. We'd like to ask you some questions about irregularities in your department's expense reports. My heart started beating faster, but I kept my voice steady. Of course. How can I help? We understand you've been managing logistics for several years and that you sign off on vendor payments and expense approvals. That's correct. Are you aware of any unusual or suspicious transactions in the past 6 months? I pretended to think about it. Actually, yes. I've noticed some payments to consulting companies that I don't remember authorizing work for. I was planning to look into it. Detective Avery made a note. Can you show us those records? Absolutely. I unlocked my filing cabinet and pulled out the folder I'd prepared. These are copies of all the questionable transactions I've identified. Payments to ZH Consulting Services, inflated transport costs, vendor payments that don't match any work orders I have on file. The detective spent 20 minutes going through the documents while I explained the normal approval process and pointed out the irregularities. They asked good questions and took detailed notes. Mr. Brooks, Detective Collins finally said, these records suggest a pattern of fraudulent billing. Do you have any idea who might have been processing these payments? Well, I said carefully, the consulting payments all went to ZH Consulting Services. I looked that up, and it's registered to Zoya Haldenor. Do you know Ms. Haldenor? She's my wife. Both detectives looked up from their notes. Your wife? Yes, and the expense approvals all came from Pierce Lawton, who's my direct supervisor. I paused. He's also been having an affair with my wife. Detective Avery closed his notebook. Mr. Brooks, I think we need to have a longer conversation. Would you be willing to come to the station and give a formal statement? Of course. But first, there's something else you should know. I pulled out the digital recorder. I have audio recordings of Mr. Lawton threatening my job if I reported what I'd discovered. I also filed a complaint with corporate compliance 2 days ago. The detectives exchanged glances. You filed a complaint? Yes. I have the case number and the name of the compliance officer I spoke with. I can give you all of that information. Mr. Brooks, Detective Collins said, it sounds like you've been very thorough in documenting this situation. I'm a logistics manager, I replied. Documentation is what I do. An hour later, I was sitting in an interview room at the State Police Barracks, giving a detailed statement about everything I'd discovered. The detectives recorded the conversation and asked me to provide copies of all my evidence. What happens now? I asked when we were finished. Now we investigate, Detective Avery said. We'll need to interview the other parties involved and examine the financial records. If the evidence supports criminal charges, we'll make arrests. How long will that take? Could be a few days, could be a few weeks. Depends on how cooperative everyone is. I drove back to the office around noon and found chaos waiting for me. Pierce's office was empty, his computer was gone, and there were rumors flying that he'd been suspended pending an investigation. Zoya had called in sick and wasn't answering her phone. Mark Stevens from HR was pacing around the break room, looking like he was about to have a panic attack. When he saw me, he practically ran over. Kellen, he said, grabbing my arm. We need to talk. About what? About the invoices, about the payments, about how much trouble we're all in. I looked at him with genuine curiosity. What makes you think we're in trouble, Mark? Because I know what's been happening. I know about the fake consulting payments and the inflated expenses. I know Pierce has been stealing money. Do you? I've been processing the paperwork. Pierce told me it was all legitimate, that it had been approved by corporate. But I knew something was wrong. Mark was sweating now, despite the air conditioning. When the detectives showed up this morning, I realized how bad this looks. What detectives? The ones investigating the financial irregularities. They talked to Pierce for 2 hours, then they took his computer and escorted him out of the building. This was news to me. Pierce was arrested? Not arrested, suspended. But they made it clear he's not supposed to leave town. I nodded sympathetically. That sounds serious. Kellen, I need to know, are you going to tell them about my involvement? Mark, what exactly was your involvement? I processed the vendor payments. I approved the expense reports. Pierce told me it was all legitimate, but I should have asked more questions. Should you have? Yes. And now I'm thinking maybe I should come clean about everything before this gets worse. I put my hand on his shoulder. Mark, I think that's probably the smart thing to do. The detectives seem like reasonable people. If you cooperate with them, I'm sure they'll take that into consideration. Mark nodded frantically. You're right. I'll call them this afternoon. Good plan. I left Mark in the break room and went back to my office, where I found a message from Janet Morrison at Corporate Compliance. The investigation was proceeding rapidly, she said, and they'd be conducting interviews with all relevant personnel over the next few days. My phone buzzed with a text from Zoya. We need to talk. Can you come home? I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, on my way. It was time for the final conversation. I found Zoya in the living room, sitting on the couch with her laptop open and papers scattered around her. She looked like she'd been crying, but her makeup was perfect and her hair was styled. Even in crisis, she maintained appearances. "The police came to my office this morning," she said without preamble. "Did they?" "They asked about ZH Consulting Services, about the payments from Northeastern Supply." She closed the laptop. "They know everything, Kellen." "Do they?" "Don't play dumb. You reported us, didn't you?" I sat down in the chair across from her. "I reported financial irregularities in my department. It's my job to report irregularities." "It's your job to destroy your own wife?" "It's my job to follow the law, something you might want to consider." Zoya stood up and started pacing. "Pierce says we can fight this. He says there's no direct evidence linking us to any intentional fraud. Pierce says a lot of things. Most of them are lies. He's hiring a lawyer, a good one, someone who specializes in white-collar defense." "That's smart. You'll probably need a good lawyer." She stopped pacing and stared at me. "You really did this. You really turned us in." "I turned in evidence of embezzlement and fraud. The fact that you and Pierce were the ones committing the crimes is just an unfortunate coincidence." "Unfortunate coincidence?" Her voice rose. "Kellen, I'm your wife." "You were my wife. Now you're a criminal who happens to live in my house." Zoya's composure finally cracked completely. "You sanctimonious piece of garbage. You think you're so much better than everyone else, with your rules and your procedures and your precious documentation." "I think I'm better than people who steal money and cheat on their spouses. But that's a pretty low bar. Pierce was right about you. You're small-time, small-minded. You'll never amount to anything because you don't have the vision to see beyond your little logistics job." I smiled. "Maybe not, but I have enough vision to see through a $500,000 embezzlement scheme, and apparently, that was enough." My phone rang. Detective Avery. "Mr. Brooks, we've made an arrest in the Northeastern Supply case. Pierce Lawton is in custody, and we'll be issuing a warrant for your wife shortly. I wanted to give you a heads up." "I appreciate that, Detective. We'll need you to come in again next week to review your statement. But I wanted you to know that your cooperation has been invaluable. This case wouldn't have been possible without your documentation." "Just doing my job." I hung up and looked at Zoya, who had gone pale during the conversation. "They arrested Pierce," I said. "I heard. They're coming for you next." Zoya sat down heavily on the couch. "What happens now?" "Now you call a lawyer, a real one, not whoever Pierce recommended. You cooperate with the investigation. You return whatever money you can, and you hope the prosecutor is feeling generous." "And us? What happens to us?" I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, Mrs. Pritchard was watering her garden again, probably wondering about all the police activity in the neighborhood. "There is no us, Zoya. There hasn't been for months, maybe longer. Kellen, I'll be filing for divorce next week. You can stay here until your legal situation is resolved, but after that, you'll need to find somewhere else to live. You can't just throw away 7 years of marriage." "I didn't throw it away. You did. I'm just cleaning up the mess." I picked up my keys from the coffee table. "I'm going back to work. When the police come, do yourself a favor and tell them the truth. All of it. It's your only chance of avoiding prison." I left her sitting there and drove back to the office, where the news of Pierce's arrest was already spreading through the building. People were shocked, excited, curious about what would happen next. I went to my office and got back to work. There were shipments to track, deliveries to coordinate, and reports to file. The logistics of running a business don't stop just because the boss turns out to be a criminal. Besides, I had a feeling I was about to get a promotion. 3 weeks later, Pierce Lawton was formally charged with embezzlement, conspiracy to commit fraud, and money laundering. The total amount stolen was just over $600,000, spread across multiple fake vendors and consulting companies over a period of 18 months. Zoya was charged as an accomplice and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. She returned the money in her ZH consulting account, roughly $80,000, and provided testimony about Pierce's role in organizing the scheme. Mark Stevens from HR was given immunity in exchange for his cooperation. It turned out Pierce had been blackmailing him over some personal financial problems, forcing him to process the fraudulent payments. The investigation also uncovered 2 other employees who had been involved in the scheme, including someone in accounts payable who had been creating fake vendor records. All told, 5 people were arrested, and Northeastern Supply recovered most of the stolen money. I was promoted to Pierce's old job as Regional Operations Manager, with a salary increase and a corner office overlooking the loading docks. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd ended up with exactly what Pierce had tried to bribe me with, except I'd earned it honestly. The divorce proceedings were straightforward. Zoya didn't contest anything, probably because she was focused on avoiding prison. We split our assets according to state law, sold the house, and went our separate ways. She ended up pleading guilty to conspiracy charges and received 2 years probation plus community service. Pierce got 4 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay full restitution. He appealed the sentence, but lost. I bought a smaller house closer to work, with a better security system and a view of the mountains. Mrs. Pritchard sent me a housewarming card with a note that said, "Glad to see you landed on your feet, dear. You always were too good for that woman." On a Friday evening in late September, I was sitting in my new kitchen, reviewing shipping reports and enjoying a beer when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. "Hello? Kellen Brooks?" "Speaking. This is Janet Morrison from Meridian Financial Corporate Compliance. I wanted to follow up on the Northeastern Supply investigation." "Of course. How can I help?" "Actually, I was calling to thank you. Your documentation and cooperation were instrumental in resolving this case. The company recovered nearly all of the stolen funds, and we've implemented new oversight procedures to prevent similar fraud in the future." "I'm glad I could help." "There's something else. Meridian is creating a new position, Director of Financial Compliance for our New England operations. It would involve overseeing fraud prevention and investigation across all our subsidiaries. The salary is substantial, and it would be based out of our Boston office." I set down my beer. "That sounds interesting." "We'd like to offer you the position. Your background in logistics, combined with your investigative skills and integrity, makes you an ideal candidate." "Can I think about it?" "Of course. Take your time. But I hope you'll consider it. We need more people like you in positions of responsibility." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen thinking about the offer. Director of Financial Compliance. It was a significant step up from operations manager, the kind of career move that could change everything. But it was also a job that existed because people like Pierce and Zoya couldn't be trusted with other people's money. A job that existed because someone had to watch the watchers. I thought about Pierce sitting in his federal prison cell, probably still convinced that he was the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own downfall. I thought about Zoya, starting over in a new city with a criminal record and a reputation that would follow her everywhere. I thought about the look on Pierce's face when the police had walked him out of the office in handcuffs, and the sound Zoya had made when she realized that all her careful planning and manipulation had collapsed around her. Some people might call what I did revenge, but revenge implies emotion, anger, a desire for payback. What I'd done was simpler than that. I'd just refused to be a victim. When someone threatens your job, your reputation, and your future, you have 2 choices. You can let them destroy you, or you can destroy them first. I chose the option that let me sleep at night. The logistics of justice, it turns out, are pretty straightforward. You document everything, you follow the evidence, and you let the system do what it's designed to do. Sometimes the system works exactly the way it's supposed to. I picked up my phone and dialed Janet Morrison's number. "Janet, this is Kellen Brooks. I've thought about your offer and I'm interested. When can we talk about details? Because if there's one thing I'd learned from this whole experience, it's that someone has to keep track of the invoices. Someone has to watch for the irregularities. Someone has to make sure that the people in charge aren't stealing everything that isn't nailed down. And apparently, that someone was going to be me. I finished my beer, closed the shipping reports, and started planning my new career in corporate compliance. It was going to be interesting work, hunting down white-collar criminals and protecting companies from their own employees. After all, I'd already proven I was good at it. Outside, the September evening was turning cool, and the mountains were outlined against a sky full of stars. It was the kind of night that made you grateful to be exactly where you were, doing exactly what you were meant to do. The last invoice in the Pierce Lawton case had been paid in full. Justice served, accounts balanced, books closed, time to start a new ledger.